Hey, what's up everybody? Chris here, and today NASA is going to land its Mars Perseverance Rover on Mars. Hey, if you're enjoying the video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Please be sure to subscribe so you'll know when more content is on the way, and you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Chris Flowers. So I really enjoy movies with a Martian setting, and what I thought we would do today is revisit a few of those offerings. And if you look at IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes, you'll see that there have been a lot of movies about Mars. I mean, a whole lot of movies. There are four in particular, though, that jump out at me as sort of running the gamut of scientifically very inaccurate to scientifically very accurate, or at least more accurate. So I wanted to take another look at these four movies and just sort of see where they end up and have a little discussion about it. As we sort of go through this, I'm going to allude to some different research that's out there, but if you look in the description for the video below, you'll see that I've linked a number of those articles so that you can see that all the information I'm including here is on the up and up. Red Planet came out in the year 2000. Really, when you go back and look at this movie, it's kind of like a 1990s time capsule a little bit, from the font that's used for the credit scenes, for the way the design of the spaceship looks, to the haircuts, to everything else. The general premise of this movie is that humanity has basically wrecked Earth, so in that sense it is accurate, and has decided to therefore make an attempt to terraform Mars. In order to accomplish this, they've sent a ton of algae up to Mars, and the thinking there is that the algae will cover the surface, allow a lot of oxygen to sort of take over, and then humans can move in and begin living their lives there. From a general premise perspective, even though this is interesting, it's not plausible in the least that the algae would survive on the surface of Mars, right? Cosmic radiation, the lack of a magnetosphere, because the core of Mars is essentially dead and has been for billions of years, would not shield the algae from radiation coming in and would therefore kill it very quickly. There's a sequence early on too where they're about to land on Mars and a solar flare crops up and causes all kinds of havoc on the spaceship. While this is certainly plausible, you would assume that NASA or any other space agency would plan accordingly for that and design the spacecraft to prevent that. But what ensues is really kind of a 90s-ish action sequence where things are blowing up and exploding, and while certainly solar flares would cause all kinds of issues, if not protected against appropriately, I don't believe that that sort of outcome would actually occur. It's a very fast-paced sequence. It's very ridiculous, but again, it's very 90s. So once the astronauts reach the surface of Mars, they soon realize that their habitat has been destroyed. All of their food and water and supplies, all of that is just gone. So it's not long thereafter that they realize they're running out of oxygen. They don't really have any options. They're sort of accepting the fact that they're about to die, but in doing so and sort of hitting that moment where their oxygen is almost totally depleted, Val Kilmer pushes a button on his suit and his helmet sort of goes up and he's ready to embrace sort of the vacuum or the near vacuum of Mars, but then he realizes he can breathe. So even though, again, the premise here is operating on this idea that algae had been sent to Mars and would have produced a lot of oxygen, even though they get there sort of assuming that a lot of that algae has died and therefore Mars is inhospitable, they remove their helmets, they can breathe. That, of course, would not be the case because there's no air pressure there, or very, very little air pressure when compared to Earth. In fact, one article that I came across said that you would need about 1 million ice cubes of carbon dioxide ice that are 1 kilometer across each to get to 1 bar of air pressure, which is comparable to what we have on Earth. So in that regard, no, they would not be able to breathe and survive once removing their helmets on the Martian surface. In addition to that, removing your helmet and therefore being exposed to all the radiation that's coming down, as I mentioned earlier, because there is no magnetosphere, would pose another potential risk. Now, the Martian atmosphere is very thin. It's about 100 times thinner than what we have on Earth, and it does block a considerable amount of radiation, but you're still getting a much higher dosage, and so things like, skin cancer become obviously a greater concern, and so you wouldn't want to be exposed to that for too long. In addition to that, there are these sort of bug creatures that live on the surface and have managed to sort of feed on the algae. Where these things came from, whether or not they were dormant in sort of the Martian soil this whole time is never really explained, but again, it's just sort of another far-fetched component of this movie. Overall, Red Planet is entertaining. Would I recommend it? Do I think it's worth a watch? Maybe. If you really just want to see something about Mars and you want to sort of go back in time and see what 90s action movies look like and 100% check your brain at the door, then this is a good movie for that. But from a scientific perspective, it is the least scientifically accurate movie on this list. Now, one of my favorite movies about Mars is Total Recall, and that's the Arnold Schwarzenegger Total Recall that came out in 1990, not the Total Recall that was made with Colin Farrell a number of years or a decade plus later. Even though this is a great movie, and the premise of this movie is so brilliant, in this movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger has a memory implanted in his head, or visits a center called Recall to have this done, where he's been to Mars on a mission serving as a spy. But when he wakes up, you're not really sure as a viewer about whether or not he's living out that memory or if he's actually going through the process of going to Mars and dealing with sort of this mega corporation conspiracy theory that has to do with hiding alien technology that could terraform the planet. So beyond the fact that it's a great movie, and in fact one of my favorite science fiction movies, there are a lot of scientific inaccuracies with it. For one thing, you'll notice that this movie really leans into the color orange. And of course, Mars is called the red planet because it has that reddish color, that reddish hue, or that orangish hue to it. But what you'll see is that the sky is really sort of a deep orange to the point of just sort of ridiculousness and dramatic effect. Now, when you look at any of the pictures that have been taken by any number of missions and rovers that have been sent to Mars to explore the planet, you'll see that it's not that orange in color. For whatever reason, the filmmakers decided that this probably would add a little bit of dramatic effect, as I just mentioned a moment ago, but anyway, that's just another one of the inaccuracies that you see in this movie. Another, I think, kind of funny part of this movie is whenever there are dream sequences, and it does happen in reality, I guess, depending on how you interpret the movie a little bit later in the film, but there are moments where certain characters have their faceplates of their helmets cracked and they're exposed to the vacuum or the near vacuum of the Martian surface. The question then is, would your eyes sort of bug out in the way that they do for Arnold Schwarzenegger and one of his companions in the movie? The short answer to that is no, though obviously it would not be a pleasant experience and you would have a very limited amount of time to find some kind of shelter or air pressure to survive that experience. But the director of this movie, Paul Verhoeven, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, also directed RoboCop, and if you're familiar with these movies in any way, shape, or form, you'll know that he really has kind of a penchant for over-the-top gore and violence and just sort of ridiculousness in that regard. So it's not surprising to see this, but again, from a scientific accuracy perspective, you would certainly die, not long after being exposed to the surface. You would have sort of an opportunity there to make it back and to sort of live out that experience. But it wouldn't be this dramatic effect where your eyes are literally bugging out of your head, your tongue becomes swollen, and all of that. However, we're going to talk about a movie here shortly that does have exposure to space, even though that's not taking place on Mars. It is a movie that's primarily set on Mars, and we'll sort of look at what the science says about that. Honestly, the most accurate thing about this movie is that there could be an alien technology waiting below the surface. I don't know that. I haven't been to Mars. It's highly unlikely, of course, but when all things are considered, even though it's a great science fiction story and very entertaining from a scientific perspective, there's just not a whole lot of weight happening with Total Recall. The next movie on the list, and this is sort of edging us toward a little bit more accurate science, just barely, minimally, is Mission to Mars. So Mission to Mars stars Gary Sinise and Tim Robbins, who are tasked with going to Mars to save one of their friends who got stranded on the surface. That sounds very familiar to another movie that we're going to look at. All in all, this is actually a pretty entertaining movie. The first time I saw it, I did not like it at all. I thought it looked overly hammy, and I actually had a really tough time getting through it just because I couldn't stop laughing at some of the sequences. And I think part of that is because I saw it on cable television once or twice in bits and pieces, but the other day I actually rented it on Amazon Prime and watched it front to back, and it was much better than I remembered. I think my biggest problem with this movie from just sort of a film going perspective is I just don't like the music. There's something about the music in the movie that just feels really kind of cheesy. I think when you compare it to other movies that have really excellent scores associated with them, that's just one of the things that sort of detracts from it for me. Overall though, this is a good movie. I would say, it's worth a watch. Much like Red Planet, this movie came out in 2000, the same year. It's kind of a time capsule. And in fact, the movie is supposed to be set in the year 2020, and here we are now in 2021. Of course, they had no way to predict that a pandemic would be something that we have to contend with, in the time that they have on Earth before they leave for their mission. But it is funny to see them rolling up in electric cars that look highly sort of, space age and futuristic compared to what we have with things like the Toyota Prius or even the Tesla now. So again, it's kind of an interesting time capsule in that perspective. But it does have a solid story, and I do think it's worth a viewing if you're interested in, sort of any kind of Mars science fiction that you haven't yet seen. And I think the premise of it overall works well. So I think the most scientifically interesting part of this movie actually occurs not on Mars, but in the space just outside of Mars. There's a sequence where the crew of the ship that's being tasked to go and save Don Cheadle, who's been stranded on Mars, has to abandon ship and make it to another vessel to then go down to the surface, but they're, in their spacesuits, sort of huddled together trying to make it to this ship. One of them, Tim Robbins, has to leave the group, break away from the group, go down and sort of attach a tether to this ship so the rest of them can pull themselves to safety. But in doing so, he doesn't manage to grab the ship and begins drifting off into space. This is a common theme in a number of movies, including Gravity, so it's probably something that's very familiar to anyone watching this. But anyway, there comes a moment where he realizes that if anyone tries to come and save him, he's going to put them at risk, and he's not willing to do that. So to make the decision easy for them, he decides to remove his helmet and therefore sacrifice himself to save the rest of the crew. Now, when he removes his helmet, he instantly turns into a popsicle. I mean, it's just sort of a full-on gray statue, frozen in the moment sort of thing for when he's exposed to the vacuum of space. Now, of course, space is very cold. It's minus 455 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And so, yes, eventually, if someone were to remove their helmet and their body ultimately was exposed to that vacuum, they would probably be frozen solid, depending on how close or not they were to a heat source like the sun. But this would not be instant, and there's a lot of good information that you can find on the web about what would actually happen to someone if they were exposed to space. This has happened to one astronaut before, where they had a small rip in their spacesuit and their skin was actually exposed to the vacuum of space and created a seal in the suit, and they had to get back, of course, inside the shuttle or the vessel that they were working with. Ultimately, they were fine, but this has happened. But if someone were exposed to the vacuum of space, they would have about 15 seconds before they lost consciousness, and they wouldn't freeze immediately. Apparently, the human body is really good at retaining heat, and it wouldn't radiate all that heat away instantly as soon as it was exposed to space. Eventually, your skin would begin to stretch and balloon to about twice its normal size as the gases and things inside your body sort of respond to that vacuum. Of course, they couldn't really illustrate that here in the movie because it was sort of a quick shot to sort of advance the story and move to the next part of what was happening with the plot. But eventually someone would pass out, even though apparently if you're in the right circumstances, even after passing out, you can survive for about 2 minutes in space if you're returned to air pressure and suitable conditions and revived accordingly with minimal damage. Of course, the main thing you'd have to worry about would be intense sunburns, and skin cancer if you're exposed to the sun for too long, maybe even frostbite, depending on, being turned away from a heat source and having to endure that for however long that may be. But no, it is inaccurate the way Tim Robbins perishes as a result of removing his helmet in the movie. Another interesting part of this that mirrors The Martian, which is the movie I'm going to look at next on this list, is that Don Cheadle is able to survive because he has a greenhouse and has plants and is able to make those last on the Martian surface. And with the right conditions, this is plausible. And this is something, again, we'll look at in The Martian, but it's a common theme between these two movies. Another thing that happens between these two movies are extreme winds. And while wind speeds on Mars can reach up to 62 miles per hour, because there's so little air pressure, the sort of destruction that we see in these movies where ships are being knocked over and habitats are being shredded and that sort of thing is not going to happen, again, because there's so little air pressure. So while Mission to Mars, I think, is an entertaining movie and does start to trend toward a little more accuracy in terms of the science, with the exception maybe of what happens at the end, which we can all speculate about because nobody's actually set foot on Mars. Again, it's highly unlikely, and I'm saying this jokingly, but the rest of the science in the movie is mostly good, I would say, with the exception of Tim Robbins' exposure to the vacuum of space and how he passes at that point. Now, I think it goes without saying that The Martian is probably the most scientifically accurate movie on this list. Yes, there's been some research done to suggest that under the right conditions, you can grow food in Martian soil if it's within a greenhouse, if sufficient nutrients are being used. In the movie, Mark Watney uses, and that's Matt Damon, he uses his own feces to grow food. And so, yeah, I think if it's done under the right conditions, the research suggests that it is a plausible thing. At one point, he uses an airlock too frequently and it blows off from his habitat. And so everything inside is sort of instantly exposed to the Martian atmosphere. And it's very cold on Mars. The average temperature on the red planet is negative 81 degrees Fahrenheit, so again, very cold. And yes, after being exposed to that, I do think that all the plants would freeze that he's been growing because all the moisture in them would suddenly become ice. And so that part of it seems realistic and at least somewhat plausible. However, there's a really good article that looks at all the different things that happen in the Martian, and it says that, when the airlock blows, it probably wouldn't shoot out in that manner that it does in the movie for kind of dramatic effect. If it was a big hole, it would just be kind of a quick whoosh instead of an explosion, because it's not like a balloon where when you have a small hole in it, it shoots all over the place. This is sort of, again, a big tear, and all the air would just escape quickly, and it would be sort of a subtle but obviously dramatic in the impact it has on all of his resources effect. And then at the end, with the Martian, and this is kind of spoilery, I assume most people have seen this movie, but at the end when he cuts a hole in his suit while he's in space trying to navigate to Hermes, his spacecraft that's trying to rescue him, he does sort of what he calls an Iron Man maneuver, and what I've seen as far as the science of this goes is that that's basically impossible. As soon as he cut a hole in his glove, his hand, the palm of his hand, would rush to seal that hole, and therefore there wouldn't be any kind of thruster he could use to navigate his way back to the ship. So while it makes for a great scene in the movie, this is probably one of the more scientifically inaccurate moments. The other one being maybe when he lifts off from the planet with basically nothing covering the top of his vessel, even though that is potentially possible because, again, as they say in the movie, there's really no air on Mars, and by the time he reaches a certain altitude, it wouldn't really matter because there's no resistance, so he doesn't need aerodynamics to really sort of make that trip. So anyway, this is my analysis of these movies, all of which are, entertaining in varying degrees. I mean, I think if you enjoy movies about Mars, they're all worth watching, if for no other reason than just to have a little bit of fun. But if you've seen these movies and if you've thought about these different scientific considerations, let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd love to have some discussion with you about this. And again, you can reach me on Twitter and we can talk about it there as well. As always, thanks for watching, and please stay tuned for more content as it'll be coming soon.